Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Jeff Dion. I serve as the Executive Director of the Victim Policy Institute, which is the legislative advocacy arm of the National Center for Victims of Crime. I'm an attorney and a survivor. I've worked on these issues for more than 20 years in just about every state of our nation. And I'm here to make two simple points. The first is about why a civil window is so important. As you've heard so many of the witnesses testify today, we know all of the various reasons why victims can't come forward earlier. But even when it takes a victim 30 years to disclose the abuse and their perpetrator is still alive, we often find that they're still molesting kids. At 70 and 80 years old, in walkers and wheelchairs, because pedophiles don't retire. And the kids that they're molesting today aren't going to be ready to come forward until sometime in the future. But if we allow these old cases to come forward, we can identify and expose perpetrators and keep kids safe today. Unfortunately, Rhode Island's short statute of limitation is a welcome mat for pedophiles. Imagine if the most important thing in your life was to be able to smoke marijuana without being harassed by the police. Where would you live? You'd move to Colorado or Washington or Oregon, where some place where it was legal. It is every bit as important to pedophiles to be able to molest kids. And so they are attracted to states with short statutes of limitation because they know they don't have to keep kids quiet forever. They just have to keep them quiet long enough to run out the clock. And Rhode Island has given them a very short clock. People need to understand why it's so important also that the liability not just focus on predators themselves, but also on those institutions. As we've heard today, the vast majority of most abuse happens within the home. Why? Because that's where predators have the greatest access to kids. And outside of the home, outside of those familial relationships, it's very difficult for someone to molest a child without help. If all a pedophile is going to do is be able to sit on a park bench and try and give out candy to kids, they're not going to be very successful. They need help. And they get that help from otherwise well-meaning institutions that hire them as employees and bring them on as volunteers. And those well-meaning institutions cannot be oblivious to the fact that there are predators that are actively trying to infiltrate their organization for the sole purpose of getting access to kids and being able to gain their trust and go through that grooming process and commit sexual abuse. That's why they need to be held accountable. You know, prosecutors have a really tough job, but they've got a very narrow job. Prosecutors have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant engaged in conduct which violated the statute and that they did so with criminal intent. If the prosecutor can prove that, they win. But the criminal law, doesn't ask questions about, well, whoever hired that person to work with kids in the first place? Or why weren't there any locks on the doors? The civil law has a much broader definition of accountability because those people, these institutions are not criminally liable, but they're civilly liable, but they're still legally liable because these actions wouldn't have happened unless they had done this. Now, people always worry about, these institutions, they shouldn't be liable just because someone that was working for them did this. I'm not talking about their vicarious liability. I'm talking about their own direct negligence. The farmer can't toss a fox into the hen house and then raise their hands and say, hey, I didn't do it. The fox did everything. right? So that's why it is so important that those institutions be held accountable. And even though these are institutions for which we have fond memories and a great deal of affinity, I was raised in the Boy Scouts. I'm an Eagle Scout. I love that organization. But you know what? Every place where we've had a civil window, in California, in Delaware, in Hawaii, in Minnesota, all of those states still have Boy Scout troops, and still have churches, and still have gymnastics, and still have Little League. And so those things don't go out of business. You're not trying to restrict the way of life that all of us grew up with and look back on fondly. All this is about is keeping kids safe. And so I would ask you to please do your duty and vote for this legislation. Thank you very much.